To quote my favorite fantasy author, Robert E. Howard, "There is no literary work to me half as zestful as rewriting history in the guise of fiction." That Howard was one of the many influences on George R. Martin should come as no surprise to anyone familiar with A Song of Ice and Fire, whether they were introduced to it through the books or the television series. It's common knowledge at this point that the main plot of A Song of Ice and Fire, a war of succession between several aristocratic houses for control of the Kingdom of Westeros, was heavily inspired by the real-life English succession crisis known as the War of the Roses, 1455 to 1487. However, Martin's lifting from history is not just limited to the main plot of his book series. The history of Westeros itself is replete with many direct parallels to actual events in the history of Great Britain. And so, this episode, for the sake of variety, and because I love historical lore almost as much as I love fictional lore, I'm going to describe the early history of Westeros up until the arrival of Aegon I Targaryen, while also providing a summarized history of early Great Britain, pointing out the parts where Martin chose to keep faithful with history and where he chose to deviate from it. This means this episode will be a little longer than my usual Brainstorm lore video, and so I must beg your indulgence. With that said, welcome to Brainstorm Lore, and welcome to the history of Westeros, from dawn to dragons. Of the Dawn Age, as with all prehistories, both real and fictional, little is known. What is known is that there were no humans living in Westeros at this time. Its only native sapients were the giants and the children of the forest. The giants had no culture or society to speak of, being a solitary species, while the children of the forest lived in small family groups or clans. If the myths and legends are to be believed, the children had very strong magic in those early days, and perhaps because of this, they never developed much technologically. Their tools and weapons were made entirely of stone, particularly obsidian, and instead of making cloth, their clothes were made entirely out of bark and leaves. The children of the forest are obviously inspired by fairies, a main staple of European and especially British folklore, while the giant is as universal a mythic monster as the dragon. Humans didn't appear in Westeros until 12,000 years prior to the Targaryen conquest. Then, a group of tribes known simply as the First Men migrated to Westeros from Essos via a land bridge known as the Arm of Dorne. This is likely a reference to the fact that during the Ice Ages, both the British Isles were connected directly to the European mainland due to low sea levels. Now, anthropological evidence tells us that human beings have inhabited the British Isles since the Stone Age, but in Game of Thrones, the First Men were already a Bronze Age culture when they arrived in Westeros. And according to archaeologists, the British Bronze Age didn't begin until around 2500 BC. For the sake of simplicity, let's just say that the First Men are analogous to the Celts, the first historically recorded inhabitants of the British Isles. Originating in what is now the Hallstatt region of Austria, by the year 275 BC, Celtic culture was arguably the most widespread in all of Europe. Nowadays, however, the only Celtic cultures and languages that still exist can be found only in the British Isles, the one exception being the Bretons of France. Anyway, back to Westeros. Relations between the children and the First Men were initially peaceful, but as time passed, the numbers of the First Men grew as they settled down and had families, and even more continued to migrate into Westeros. Soon the human population had grown to the point where the First Men began encroaching on the children's forests. The final straw came when they began cutting down the weirwood trees that are sacred to the children, and war was declared. As with all things regarding the Dawn Age, the war between the children of the forest and the First Men is almost lost to history. Only two events of note are remembered. The first event was when the children used their magic to create a massive flood that destroyed the land bridge connecting Westeros and Essos. The second was a lesser flood that inundated the region known as the Neck, converting it into the swampy barrier between the north and the other kingdoms that it is today. For all their magic, though, in the end the children realized that their defeat and likely extinction was inevitable. The First Men and their superior bronze weapons were simply too numerous, and so the children sued for peace. Fortunately for them, the First Men were just as tired of the war as they were. So it was that on the Isle of Faces, the leaders of the Children of the Forest and the First Men agreed to a pact. The First Men would have free reign of the open places, the plains, mountains, and coasts, but they would not touch the forests of the Children, nor would they harm the sacred weirwood trees. The Children of the Forest present at this meeting carved faces into the weirwood trees on the island as a sign that their gods were witness to this pact. Thus the Dawn Age ended, and the so-called Age of Heroes began. When talking about the Age of Heroes, it is often difficult to separate fact from fanciful myth. There are countless sagas, still told by storytellers around the fire to this day, of First Men heroes and their fantastical exploits. Unsurprisingly, most of these heroes are credited as the ancestral founders of the ruling houses of the Seven Kingdoms. Noteworthy figures include Lan the Clever, the Grey King, Durin Godsgrief, and Garth Greenhand. The most credible and oft-repeated legend from the Age of Heroes was the event known as the Long Night. In the world of Game of Thrones, seasons can last for years rather than mere months, and the Long Night was a winter said to have lasted an entire generation. As if freezing temperatures and lack of food wasn't bad enough, the First Men soon found themselves under threat from beings known as the White Walkers, or simply the Others. Malevolent entities that could not be killed by anything save obsidian, and revived those fallen in battle to serve them as undead wights. The White Walkers were only defeated at the climactic Battle for the Dawn, where the First Men, Children of the Forest, and the surviving giants united to drive them back into the lands of always winter. It was then that Bran the Builder, legendary ancestor of House Stark, led the construction of the Wall, an enormous barrier of magic ice, built to guard against any future return of the White Walkers. Bran also oversaw the founding of the Night's Watch, a sworn brotherhood of men from all across Westeros who forsook family, land, and liegelord to stand sentinel against the return of the ancient enemy. Martin evidently decided not to include an equivalent to the Roman occupation of Britain in his History of Westeros. The closest we get to that is the Wall, which is a nod to Hadrian's Wall, built by the emperor of the same name in the year 122 AD. At any rate, with the end of the Long Night, peace and relative prosperity returned to Westeros. Meanwhile, across the sea in Essos, events were set in motion. The freehold of Valyria, a civilization ruled by men who rode the backs of fire-breathing dragons, was in the ascendancy. With the obvious advantage of literal air and fire power, the Valyrians overthrew the empire of Old Gis and replaced it with an empire of their own, enslaving all who submitted to their rule and incinerating those who dared to resist them. Some peoples opted to flee before the oncoming dragon lords. One of these tribes were the Andals, a people recently united under the Faith of the Seven, which worshipped a singular god with 7 aspects, an obvious parallel to Christianity and the Holy Trinity. Supposedly inspired by a divine revelation, an Andal leader known as Hugor of the Hill chose to lead his people across the sea to Westeros, with the intention of conquering it and making it their new home. This obviously parallels the migration of the Anglo-Saxons to Britain. The Anglo-Saxons were a collection of Germanic tribes who migrated across the North Sea in the 5th century and eventually established the Kingdom of England. But here, Martin chooses to play an interesting role reversal. In Game of Thrones, it was the Andals who bring the Faith of the Seven with them to Westeros and ultimately converted the majority of its inhabitants to their new religion. Meanwhile, in real-world history, the native Britons were already Christian, and the Anglo-Saxons were pagans who eventually adopted the faith of those they conquered. Successfully making landfall in a region known as the Fingers, the Andals soon spread throughout Westeros. The Andals had no regard for the Children of the Forest, often slaughtering them wherever they could be found and burning their sacred groves, which inevitably brought them into conflict with the First Men. The First Men were far more numerous, but they wielded weapons of inferior bronze, and the Andals, though few, wielded superior steel. In some cases the Andals conquered, such as the Vale, the Riverlands, and Dorne, but in other cases the Andals made terms with the native First Men rulers and even intermarried with them, such as in the Westerlands, the Stormlands, and the Reach. Only the North successfully resisted the Andal invasion, retaining their ways and ancient traditions. And while the Andals did manage to conquer the Iron Islands, the faith of the Seven was never able to really supplant worship of the drowned god. Originally, Westeros was a land of 100 kings, each squabbling with one another for land and honor and glory. But time passed, and these various petty domains eventually began to coalesce into strong kingdoms, each ruled by a great house. The Starks ruled the north, the Gardeners the Reach, the Lannisters the Kingdom of the Rock, the Durrandons ruled the Stormlands, and the Arryns the Kingdom of the Mountains and the Vale. The Iron Islands and the Riverlands would eventually be unified under the Ironborn ruler Harwin Hardhand of House Hor, establishing the Kingdom of the Isles and the Rivers. Then, around 700 years before the conquest, a new tribe of people arrived in Westeros, the Rhoynish. Having recently been conquered by the Valyrian freehold, 10,000 Rhoynish ships fled their ancient homeland along the river Rhoyne and crossed the sea, under the command of Princess Nymeria, for the Rhoynish believed that women to be just as capable of leadership as men. After many years and several disastrous misadventures at sea, the Rhoynish fleet finally made landfall on the coast of Dorne, whereupon Nymeria burnt the ships, informing her people that their wanderings were at an end. Knowing herself to be a stranger in a strange land, Nymeria began looking for an ally, and she finally found one by marrying Lord Mors of House Martell. Together, the two of them subdued the neighboring petty kings and united the land of Dorne under their rule. Though Nymeria's people would eventually adopt the faith of the Seven, the Dornishmen in turn adopted many Rhoynish customs, such as allowing women to stand in line of succession, and Dornish rulers would adopt the Rhoynish titles of Prince or Princess of Dorne, as opposed to King or Queen. Meanwhile, back across the ocean, the Valyrians continued to expand their dominion. By the year 314 before the conquest, the Valyrians had even established an outpost in Westeros on the small island of Dragonstone. 2 centuries later, the Dragon Lord Aenar Targaryen would move his family to the island. Supposedly, this was after his daughter Daenerys had received a prophetic vision foretelling Valyria's destruction. And it was just as well that they did, for 12 years later, the doom came to Valyria. No one knows exactly how or why it happened. All that is known is that Valyria was destroyed in a series of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. And since the majority of Valyria's nobility and their dragons were living there at the time, they were all but annihilated in the destruction. To this day, Valyria remains a burnt and broken wasteland, ostensibly haunted by demons. Those few dragon lords that survived the doom ultimately destroyed each other in wars of succession. And soon, the Targaryens, safe on their little island, were the only dragon riders left in the world. The Targaryens quietly spent the next century on Dragonstone, only occasionally involving themselves in the affairs of the East. But eventually, 2 years before the conquest for which he would be famed, Aegon Targaryen, the great-great-great-grandson of Aenar, would turn away from his ancestral lands and set his sights on the West. But that is a story for another time. For now, I'd like to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving and make an announcement. Since I've saved up enough free time this week, I'm going to take a break from lore videos and do an analysis of a franchise that has been treated very poorly in the last few years. I'm going to try and make the video ready by next Tuesday, but since this will be a fairly lengthy affair, I make no promises. Next time, why do we care about the Terminator? Until then. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.